Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, it's Super Tuesday, and we're reading that voter turnout is going to be pretty low. I think that theory means that it'll probably favor the GOP over the Democrats. I did receive a ballot this year. Last time I didn't get one, and I had to call for one, but now it's off in the mail. So, probably the most interesting race is the race for Senate, which is going to be for the top two spots. So I was amazed that I read the other day that Steve Garvey is pretty close behind Adam Schiff. So Tim, you're our expert in California politics. How did this happen? And considering that Garvey didn't have a lot of funds and has made pretty few appearances, how do you think he got so close to Schiff?
Well, he has Adam Schiff to thank for him being so close to that because, we've seen this strategy a few times before. Actually, Gavin Newsom employed this when he ran for governor in 2018. We saw Gray Davis do this when he was reelected governor in 2002. It's about picking your opponents. And so, Adam Schiff had enough popularity among Democratic voters in California that it always was pretty much a foregone conclusion he would finish in the top two. So knowing that, how do you make sure then that you win the general election in November? Well, pick the weakest opponent. And when you have $35 million in the bank and you have a big spending super PAC with millions and millions of dollars more, you run advertising promoting the weakest of your opponents, hoping they will get over the finish line to November as well. And that's exactly what he has done. So Steve Garvey's campaign has really been non-existent, right? He's ducked a lot of media interviews. He's not really out there very much. He has been in the debates, but he hasn't been very strong. He's raised under $2 million thus far in the whole campaign. I mean, that's not even enough to buy 1 week of statewide television. So what you've seen is that Adam Schiff's campaign has spent over $10 million and the super PAC on television advertising and mailing saying Steve Garvey is too conservative for California. He voted for Donald Trump twice, this, that, and the other to try to, and obviously he sent that to Republican voters, not Democrats, to try to hammer home to Republican voters, hey, Steve Garvey's a Republican. We should vote for him. And so when you're a Republican, and you get in the mail, Steve Garvey is too conservative. He voted for Donald Trump. Republican voter in Fresno or Redding or Bakersfield is going to look at that and say, well, maybe we should vote for him for the Senate, because obviously the typical Republican voter doesn't like Adam Schiff. And it's working. In the latest poll that came out on Friday, the UC Berkeley LA Times poll, Steve Garvey actually has moved into first place by consolidating the Republican vote. Because remember, over a quarter of voters in California are still Republican. So there are millions of Republican voters. And it's a very low turnout. The latest numbers that I saw, and these are as of Monday morning, is that we've had just about 3 million votes cast, either by mailing in or in person at early vote centers. That's about 13.9% of the vote returned so far. And the votes are skewing old and Republican and white. So, even though we have, actually, it's pretty even among the different age demographics statewide among registered voters. Well, right now, the demographic is 57% of the ballots returned are 65 and older. And the next highest number is 50 to 64. And the numbers that the third Senate candidate, Katie Porter, needs to get over the top, her base are 18 to 34. And they're the lowest number of return ballots right now. And then same ethnically, a higher number of the ballots returned are Republicans. Republicans are 24% of registered voters. Right now, 32% of the electorate is Republicans so far who've returned their ballots. So when you add that all together, what it looks like is it looks pretty good that Garvey and Schiff are going to make the top two. And if that happens, Adam Schiff can measure the drapes, because the same LA Times poll showed that in the fall, if the top two are Schiff and Garvey, Schiff wins by 15 points. If the top two are Porter and Garvey, Porter wins by 15 points. If the top two are Schiff and Porter, it's a dead even, 30 to 30. So Adam Schiff can basically if the strategy works, and it looks like based on who's returning votes, it's going to work, he can basically guarantee his election by getting Steve Garvey across the finish line.
Tim, I would like to try to unpack what's going to happen after the votes are counted. One thing that I was interested in and seen a bit of a trend over the last few elections is where the Hispanic vote is going to go. In the last few elections, they were moving more towards Republicans, and it'll be interesting to see if Garvey takes some independent votes as well as the Hispanic vote.
Well, what's interesting right now we don't know who they voted for, but as far as returning ballots, they're 70% of the electorate right now, as of the latest numbers, are white, versus 55% of voters overall are white. 28% are Hispanic, and it's a much lower percentage of their overall numbers of registered voters have returned so far. Now, more people are going to return ballots Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So these numbers are going to go up, and obviously the older and wider numbers are going to drop a bit. But that's going to be interesting to see. Most experts believe that total turnout is going to be 30% at most, maybe a little under. And there really has been nothing to drive Hispanic voters to the polls. There's been nothing to drive younger voters to the polls. And that's who, if you're a Katie Porter, if you're a Barbara Lee, that's who you need to come out and vote for you. So it'll be interesting to see in the general election, when it's a whole different environment, where do Hispanic voters go in California? Do Hispanic voters in California mirror Hispanic voters in Texas and Florida that have been a little more Republican as of late? Remember, too, Hispanic is not a monolith. So, voters who are Mexican might have a different outlook than voters who are Costa Rican, than voters who are Puerto Rican, than voters who are Venezuelan. So you might get really individualized, where Hispanic voters who came from communist countries, for example, may tend to vote more Republican than Hispanic voters that came from Mexico or Puerto Rico, say.
So, Tim, do you think that if Garvey makes it to the ballot, will he actually begin to raise some serious money from the GOP? Or do you think he'll be satisfied with just even making it on the ballot?
I think there will be some temptation among people who don't know how politics goes in California to say, is there a sign that Republicans have a shot in California? So maybe he could raise a little money, but he'd have to have an infrastructure in place to capitalize on that. And Mitch McConnell and the Senate super PACs that fund races, they're not going to spend any money in California. You can get a bigger bang for your buck spending money in Montana or Ohio or West Virginia than you can in California. So there's that. But B, they read the same poll we do. Garvey starts out 15 points behind in the general election to Schiff, if that is ultimately the top two. So they know in the end of the day, yes, it would be a great thing to have a Democrat and Republican in the general election. Voters in the major parties wouldn't feel disenfranchised in the November election. But, you're still saying that the Republican who got nearly all the Republican vote in the primary would only have gotten 25% of the vote. So I think it'll be kind of a similar thing in the end. And if for whatever reason Garvey shows in the polls that he is becoming competitive, the Democrats will just spend a fortune beating him up.
So, Tim, are there any races that you're following?
Well, I think one interesting race to me that's kind of a good chess match is the race for mayor of Sacramento. Now, for all of you who may not be following politics in Sacramento, typically Sacramento elects a more establishment Democrat as the mayor. And we've had Darrell Steinberg is finishing up his 2 terms as mayor, and he has, I will charitably say, been not the most successful mayor. For example, homelessness in the city has exploded on his watch and seems to be out of control with no end in sight. It's so bad the district attorney is suing him over the city's refusal to enforce the laws. So we have a 4-way race for mayor, and we don't have ranked choice voting or any kind of thing like that. So unless no one gets 50%, which it's unlikely with 4 big candidates that anyone's going to get 50%, then you'll have the top 2 go to November. And so you have former city councilman Steve Hansen. He is running. He's I would say, a pretty centrist Democrat. He's talking about crime and homelessness and accountability in his campaign. He's a leader in the LGBT community, and he also is a candidate most center-right voters are supporting. He's backed by the chamber and a lot of law enforcement groups. He's running against former Senator Richard Pan, who was in the state legislature for over a decade, but he probably didn't really make front page news. His main issue was vaccines, and that kind of cuts both ways in our environment today. You have Assemblyman Kevin McCarty, who is, a pretty left-wing Democrat. He's formerly on the city council. He's raised, I believe, the most amount of money, and so a lot of the institutional left is supporting him. And then you have Flo Kofer, who is kind of she's a newcomer. She's some sort of a doctor, but she is the Bernie Sanders AOC type candidate. And so we'll see which of these makes the top two. The only polling I've seen in the race is you saw Richard Pan was in first place, and McCarty and Hansen were battling it out for second place. So if you had, say, McCarty and Pan or McCarty and Hansen in the general election, you'd have a pretty strong contrast, I would say. If you had a Pan and a Hansen in the general election, that's a pretty of two kind of similar profile candidates. So it's very interesting, but the chess game that's played Tuesday will really determine what kind of race are we going to have in the fall, whether it's a sleepy race or a real barn burner. And I think we're on track for a real barn burner of a race in November. No one thus far has really run away with it in March. So you could have a lot of people bunched up together and, the potential for just about anything to happen. Whatever happens on election night in this race and in many other interesting primary races around the state, again, it's going to be determined by turnout. So this older, wider Republican skewing electorate could have real impacts on who makes it to the top two. So we could have some really interesting, surprising results based on that. The other thing, last thing to remember is that, the counting of elections, it's not election night, it's election month. And so what we have counted after election night probably is going to be 35 to 40% of the vote. So there's a lot more since it's all mail-in ballots, there's a lot more ballots that are being processed and that are going to come in. So we may have a little bit of a mirage of who's leading after election night. That may not be the final story. So you're going to have a lot of interesting up and down developments tracking your favorite races over the coming weeks. But we will keep track of everything here on Next Round, and we will talk about some of the interesting results next week and in the coming weeks. And we'll certainly be writing about it at our Right by the Bay blog.
Tim, so how about introducing our next guest?
So this week on the podcast, we have Rea Hederman from the Buckeye Institute. They're our sister think tank in Ohio, and they have a terrific new study that, kind of mirroring the work of our Wayne Weingarten and our Pam Lewison, they look at the impact of some of these global climate change initiatives that the Biden administration is pushing, and they look at the impact that it would have not only on farmers if they are implemented. Remember, California is the nation's #1 agriculture state. Those of you living in LA may not realize that, but it is true. And then also the impact on consumers. And as we talk about it on the podcast, our Lance Izumi, who never met something produced by a cow he didn't like to eat, is going to be shocked when he learns how much American cheese is going to cost if the Biden administration has their way.
Thanks so much, Tim. And here's Rea Hederman. Welcome to Next Round, Rea.
Thank you for having me.
So we know that President Trump and President Biden had very different policy agendas when it came to global warming. Inspired by California's green mandates, President Biden has pursued a goal of, quote, net zero carbon emissions. Talk about some of these policies, regulations, and legislation that the Biden team and their allies in Congress are pushing to achieve their green agenda.
Yeah, on day one, when President Biden took office, he committed the United States to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, which basically say you must abide by net zero, no green energy gases. So as a consequence, the Biden administration has been imposing a raft of regulations aimed at the fossil fuels and aimed at consumers. So to give you an idea of just kind of a lot of the broad regulations, for example, is everything from canceling the Keystone Pipeline on day one, Most recently, we saw that they delayed approval from the liquid nitrogen gas export terminals. They're also looking at, regulating cars, like how many cars can be sold electric versus an internal combustion, a gas-powered engine. We're looking at EPA rules, on refrigerators and air conditions. And finally, we're looking at probably maybe most importantly is the administration is really putting moratoriums on oil and gas leases and really trying to make it harder for the fossil fuel industry to expand their production, be able to develop new sources for energy. And the consequence on all these is going to be raised energy costs on consumers, which we know will have a negative impact on the economy.
So while each of these goals may sound very lofty, they actually should have taxpayers gasping for air because, as we know firsthand in California, government green mandates are hugely expensive and they add significant new costs and burdens to employers. So the Buckeye Institute in your paper set about to document how these green mandates would impact specifically farmers and the consumers of their products. So share with our listeners a little bit about kind of your thoughts going into this paper. How did you develop the model for your study and what were some of the potential impacts that you measured?
Yeah, sure, Tim. Most of us, when we think about the climate change, and going to green, net zero, getting rid of greenhouse gases, you think a lot about, coal plants, heavy manufacturing plants. And, we need to remember that we've made huge progress on cutting our greenhouse emissions, switching from coal to natural gas, technological improvements. But now what we're seeing is to get to where the United States needs to be to abide by the climate accords that the Biden administration bound us to, that we have to look at different industries at greenhouse gases. And so the agricultural sector, even though you think about farmers practicing, organic practices, being one with nature, produces a fair amount of greenhouse gases. And so the agricultural sector has fallen under the crosshairs of rule makers because this is an industry that produces about 10% of our nation's total carbon. And so we wanted to look and say, what is going to be the impact of on the farmers? And if you're driving up input costs, what we call, basically how much it costs for a farmer to actually do business, how is that going to impact what we pay at the grocery store? What's it going to pay when we go out to eat? What's the bottom line impact of consumers' grocery bill? So we came up with a model using government data, using data from around the world that looks at what would happen if the Biden administration essentially taxed the carbon outputs that farmers must operate under these new climate regulations that are necessary. And, we've looked to Europe as an example of some of these increased costs. And then we've looked at proposed rules from the Biden administration. So, for example, we've seen SEC rules that could increase the cost of farmers obtaining credit. And so what we found is, on basis, the average operating cost of a farm is going to go up about 34% every year. And consumers are going to find their grocery stores increasing about 15% per year. And, I don't think this is probably surprising for y'all because, PRI has done a lot of great research looking at the impact to people in California for having to pay for green energy regulations, because what these regulations do is there are artificial price increases on consumers and businesses that impact their bottom line.
So, Ray, let's break down what you found in your research. California is the nation's #1 agricultural state. So we know that the Biden administration's new green mandates will have a big impact on Central Valley farmers. How much will their costs rise if the Biden administration gets their way?
Yeah, so what the Biden administration will do is drive up cost on farmers in both directly and indirectly. Directly are things, for example, such as higher costs on diesel, which farmers need to drive their tractors, higher costs on fossil fuels. So some of it you might think about very directly, like gas for tractors, gas for combines, but farmers also use propane fuel, for example. So if their crops get wet, they need to quickly dry those out for storage or before they go to market. And so when you're increasing the price of propane, that drives up farmer cost. But one of the biggest shocks to farmers will be the cost of fertilizer. Because most fertilizer is nitrogen, and nitrogen is made with natural gas. And so, our research found is that the cost of fertilizer is going to go up about 30%. Other studies, including the World Economic Forum, has found fertilizer costs are going to increase by about 26% as a result of these regulations. And again, the bottom line is this all adds up to a big hit to farmers. So, for example, if you're an average farm, say 750 acres of corn, the typical American farm, your average costs are going to go up about $60,000 per year. And those costs are going up again because of fertilizer, increased fertilizer costs. They're also going up because of cost of drying your propane, cost of diesel, other costs of fuel needs that your farm requires. And there are also a few other indirect costs, has rules that can govern how farmers can get credit. Well, that's going to increase the cost of some farmers more than other. So if you're a rancher in Central California, you may face a higher cost of loans because you have a worse ESG score under proposed regulations than, say, for somebody who's an organic wheat farmer. And so we see a lot of different ways that farmers are going to be impacted, but the bottom line is it's going to be a substantial cost to the average farmer, really driving up their annual costs, their profit losses, and they're going to be forced to pass on those costs to consumers, which are American families who eat food, the worldwide agricultural market, people in other countries. And so grocery bills are going to increase substantially.
Well, Ray, as we've seen with government green energy mandates in California, those who bear the brunt of these policies are actually the poor and working class. So based on what you found in your research, what will be the impact on consumers at the grocery store or at their favorite restaurant if the Biden agenda goes through? How much will some of people's favorite foods potentially go up in price?
Well, right now, I think American consumers are reeling every time they go to the grocery store. I mean, data came out in February showing that Americans are spending more on food than any time in over 3 decades. And that's because, everything from government policies that driven up the price of labor and because of inflation. But unfortunately, the bad news, just doesn't stop with the February report on food. Our report shows that the cost to consumers is going to be substantial. On top of the prices that American families are already facing, we find that the American annual grocery store bill is going to increase by about 15%. So right now, the average family of 4 spends over $8,000 per year. Our study shows it's going to go up to about $9,700. And some food articles are going to be impacted more than others. So for example, cheese, beef, those are going to almost double in price, increasing by 70% or more. And the reason is because the dairy and beef industry, livestock industry, is kind of hit by a double whammy through a lot of these policies. So for example, anything that increases the cost of corn or other food crops that then becomes input to cows, for example, that'll drive up dairy farmers. But also we know that because these businesses are going to be highly regulated in the amount of greenhouse gases a farm emits, well, livestock emissions are more heavily penalized than just grain farmers. So again, that's one of the reasons we see beef and cheese going up 70, 80% in some cases. But all crops are increasing fairly dramatically. Rice, you think about the impact on rice farmers in California, where they're going to have to deal with the fact that American families will be paying over 50% more for rice per year. Things like pork, for example, will increase by about a third. Eggs will increase by about a third on top of the prices we're already found. So this has a big impact on American consumers. It means, what are they going to be doing less of? Our research shows that, they'll be driving less. This $1,500 is basically a mortgage payment a family's going to make. And so this has a real cost to decision makings that families make every time they sit down to do their monthly and yearly budget. Because if they're spending this much more on food, that means less a vacation, maybe less savings for retirement, or less opportunities for their children.
Our Lance Izumi, he jokes with us that he doesn't eat it unless it came from a cow. He was particularly outraged by how much American cheese would go up. I think he's probably the biggest consumer of American cheese in the country.
Well, I think, this is one of those things where we've seen in other countries that have already implemented some of these policies. You have shortages in the grocery store because there simply aren't enough cheese being produced to meet the needs of some of the consumers at any price. And this is the problem with these top-down policies, Tim.
Well, let's go into that idea a bit more. Many of these policies have been implemented or are being implemented in the European Union, countries that have signed up for the Paris Climate Accord. We've all read about the farmers protesting these policies in the Netherlands, France, and even Germany. So paint the picture for us. What are farmers and consumers experiencing as a result of these policies? And what are lessons from their experience can we learn here in the U.S.?
Well, we felt very fortunate in some ways that the European farmer protests were perfectly coincided to when we wrapped this paper up, because I think Europe's a real world example of what happens when farmers and countries are faced with these regulations that are required to get to net zero. Essentially, what's happened is that Europe has said that we're really going to try to force everybody to abide by the policies they put in place. And that means selling carbon emissions credits for much higher costs. And what that means is that these farmers, all of a sudden, the cost of farming has increased dramatically in Europe. So, for example, we found that European farm costs have increased by about 40+%, and European food has increased by about 40%. But even worse for some farmers, other than having to pay more for energy prices, is the fact that some things they rely on to do their business simply don't exist anymore. European fertilizer plants have closed in Germany and the Netherlands, and as a result, they're now having to import American fertilizer. And so, Germany, for example, is proposing a tariff on American fertilizer because they have simply shut down their fertilizer industry in Germany. But they still need to be able to bring in fertilizer for the farmers. And so farmers are having to pay a tariff on American fertilizer that, again, that's higher farm costs that make it more difficult for them to pass on costs to their customers. But maybe even more shocking is kind of some of the policies European countries have proposed that go beyond just tariffs and fertilizer. So, for example, in the Netherlands, they've actually allocated over $1 billion to give the government the power of eminent domain, which means using government power to take over farms and dairy herds to then cull, i.e. slaughter dairy herds, to reduce those farm emissions so the Netherlands can comply with the EU treaties. Same thing in Ireland, right? You think about how famous Irish dairy Kerrygold butter, Irish cheese has been. They've actually proposed killing over 1 million cows in Ireland to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And when you start taking over dairy herds, when you start killing off your cows, you start getting shortages. And that's what we've seen in some grocery stores in the Netherlands, where Dutch consumers are not able to get cheese and beef when they want it because there's not as much available. So that, so if you think about that in the context of the ongoing farmer protests, it's the fact that farmers have seen their farms taken over. They've seen higher costs for diesel fuel, and they've seen the inability for them to be able to get fertilizer because Europe has shut down their fertilizer plants, forcing them to turn to other countries to be able to meet their agricultural needs.
Reading your paper, I was shocked to read about that these green mandates, certainly are a tremendous cost burden, but they can also have some pretty devastating effects. You talk about what's gone on in Sri Lanka, which has experienced real problems with that use of artificial fertilizer being curtailed due to these policies. And they actually fell into a famine that was caused by this global green agenda that's had such a negative impact for their country. So could you share with our listeners the tale of Sri Lanka's horrific policy-driven famine and the lessons we should all take from that?
Yeah, well, fertilizer quite simply is important for crop production. It boosts crop yield, which means you produce more food for the same amount of on the same amount of land, right? And so what Sri Lanka did is said, we're going to ban nitrogen fertilizer, again, which uses natural gas, in an effort to meet their Paris climate pledge. So Sri Lanka said, we're not going to use nitrogen fertilizer on our fields, and that'll help us meet our net zero pledge. And the consequence of that is that all of a sudden, Sri Lankan crops started falling, right? So their crop yields fell by about a third, which meant there were grain and food shortages in the country. Because imagine here in this, in our country, if all of a sudden our wheat and our corn yields all decline by a third because we said we can't use the most popular brand of fertilizer. So what we started to see is that food prices increased by about 90%, almost doubled in Sri Lanka. But even worse, we saw that Sri Lankan adults, about a quarter of them, started to skip meals to give their fair share of food to their children. About half of Sri Lankan families report that their children have been forced to go hungry and miss meals because there's not enough food available at a price that's affordable for those families. So when you enact these policies that sit there and say, to abide by our green energy promises, we're going to reduce the amount of food that's made available, it's not surprising that countries that are struggling or in the process of developing are seeing people start to go hungry again because they're simply not producing enough food to satisfy their population.
Ray, we've done a lot of work here at PRI documenting the growing push for environment, social, and governance investing, or ESG, which has pretty negative consequences for public pension funds and other areas of our economy. So your study documents that the push for ESG investing is also having a negative impact on food producers. How's this?
Yeah, Rena, I think thanks to your work at PRI, people are starting to understand how people are using government regulations to push ESG, again, primarily on pensions. But now we're starting to see some of these proposed rules impact the agricultural sector as well. So a couple of examples that we look at in our paper. One is, for example, that they force agricultural farmers to buy a government monitoring service per year to record their greenhouse gases, right? So that's a government regulation, kind of a mandate, about $1,200 a year, where people have to report back and they're monitored. The second thing is that, we've seen rules, again, coming up from the SEC, looking at how people can get credit based on their scores of how much carbon they emit. And again, this is something we've seen play out in Europe. And so the idea behind this is very simple, that if bankers and lenders give you a poor score saying you're emitting too many gases, well, then your ability to get a loan is restricted. You might have to pay higher interest rates, or in the case of some European farmers, the ability to get a loan whatsoever is basically canceled. They cannot get a loan to replace worn out farm equipment. You can't get an advance of money to be able to plant new crops. And this has a consequence of driving up, again, the cost of farming, because if you're raising rates on farmers, particularly on livestock farmers, then of course that's going to drive out, farms of family farms, going to drive out medium farms, people that don't have the ability to spread costs the way the large corporate farms do. And so I think, it's telling from, one of the asset fund managers and kind of one of the activists in this space basically said, cows are the new coal on the climate change agenda. And then the idea is, just like they've kind of brought ESG a bear on pension funds trying to divest from fossil fuels industries, they're looking at livestock and they're looking at agricultural practices in the same way.
So finally, as we close, now that we know the devastating impacts these green mandates are having and would have, what's your advice to policymakers? What can be done to prevent these huge costs from being imposed on working class Americans who are already struggling with high inflation and higher interest rates?
Yeah, I think, the first is kind of the old doctor's adage of do no harm, right? And so, you're looking at the fact that consumers are paying the food bills at a 30-year plus high. And you want to be careful about adding more costs for them for no return. And then you take a look at kind of what's happened in Europe, again, where you see policies that have been enacted of closing fertilizer plants, policies that have been enacted to deny loans to farmers. Those have all driven up food costs and food insecurity. And so I think we need to be careful and reconsider some of these rules. So I think what can be done is a couple of things. One is, things like this podcast, Tim, where people understand the policies being proposed. People don't like that, right? I mean, there's American, part of our American culture is the idea that farmers are valuable entities that we protect, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Willie Nelson, and Farm Aid, we're all trying to protect the small farm. Similar forms of educational outreach needs to be done so people understand the impact of all these regs that are being proposed. The second thing is, Congress needs to continue to resist and be able to push back on a lot of this executive branch overreach, right? A lot of these rules are being done by the Biden administration. And so making sure that Congress, where they can step in and say, no, that's not right. That would be, for example, rolling back some of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies to green energy practices or green energy mandates, to basically say, no, we're not going to subsidize this behavior that hurts farmers and hurts consumers. Taking a look and pressuring the Biden administration to say, we're not going to abide by the Paris Climate Accords. We're going to continue to reduce greenhouse gases, but in a sustainable manner. And then taking a look, I think, is making sure people understand a lot of these rules that I think have been tried to be snuck through that are proven to be very unpopular. We've seen some success, for example, again, as you guys know, on the ESG movement affecting, pensions and some of those rules. You've seen some of those entities starting to back out, and say, hey, we've gone too far. We're going to reconsider. We're leaving some of these coalitional allies because people understand the cost that these rules have. And so I think the more that people understand that the reason why you're going to be paying more at the grocery store as some of these net zero policies, the more pressure there is on politicians to slow things down and make sure that prudence is a principle instead of fealty to kind of a green ideology. And so, Tim, I think one of the things is, again, I think California's been a great bad example because, costs have gone up so much on the monthly energy bill, for people in California that, from out here in Ohio, it seems that, you even have Democratic legislatures, reconsidering rules that you force Californians to abide by. Everything, for example, from paying more on utility bills, depending on your income level, to basically phasing out gas cars. I've seen politicians in Washington pause on that rules, and I think you're seeing that in California and other states as well.
The fun thing in California is, of course, on the bill about electric bills based on income is they're trying to say, legislators who voted for these bills are trying to say, we didn't know that was in the bill. But of course, the tape does not lie. The author of the bill, it was a budget trailer bill. The author of the bill said quite clearly on the record, here's what it will do. And it is quite clearly stated in the analysis of the bill. But I think the big takeaway for the rest of the country from what we're doing in California is don't do what we're doing.
I think, too, about the Biden administration says we're going to mandate so many green cars being bought by consumers in a very short period of time, only to have car manufacturers, push back and say, well, we don't have the technology, to be able to hit that goal right now. We can't abide by that. And then you see the market forces at work where people are saying, wait, this technology is too expensive. We can't afford it. And so as a consequence, you've seen the Biden administration slowing that rollout, or at least trying to push it past this election. So, the more people know about this, the more people understand about the high costs that are coming down from Washington politicians and bureaucrats. I think the more pushback you'll see at the state, local, and federal level as people simply don't want to pay more for something that has a very poor return.
And as we've seen in California, maybe it's the canary in the coal mine, electric vehicle sales fell double digits over the last 2 quarters. So if people aren't buying electric cars here, where are they going to buy them?
Exactly. And I think, that's a big, a lot of reports right now that Detroit's very worried about their bottom line because consumers simply aren't buying them at the price point that's being offered.
Yeah, and our colleague Ben Smithick, who's got a Tesla, he doesn't want to buy another one.
That's right. And, and I think, Tim, we actually cite, a little bit of California, is something that we've talked about doing this paper because, for example, you guys have said not only are we going to force everybody to buy electric cars, but it's not just everyday people. It's, farmers in their pickup trucks. Still the idea, for example, on the big rigs, right? I mean, like 18-wheelers, being forced to be electric. And what that means is it's more costly now with electric 18-wheelers to do a job compared to a regular gas-powered car. And that's a loss for consumers' welfare, right? I mean, that's a loss to businesses' bottom line. And quite frankly, I think it makes California a lot less competitive with other states because people are not going to want to deal with the increased costs of your regulations.
And then, of course, when we're not putting out Latino entrepreneurs who own landscaping businesses out of work because we're going to ban gas-powered lawn equipment and gas-powered generators needed to. We're going to also ban gas ovens used in commercial kitchens. So bakeries in Southern California that produce goods both for restaurants and for grocery stores, that's going to be hugely expensive and technologically impossible in both cases. Really, the market just isn't there with electric alternatives. So one way or the other, we're going to get you with our green mandates in California.
Right. And, we talk about in the paper that, going to an electric farm tractor is just not feasible for most farmers. And in fact, in many cases, not only can it reduce crop yields, but can also damage your farmland because, electric tractors, a lot of time with the weight of the battery is much heavier than some traditional factories. So it's kind of a lose-lose. And that's one of the reasons I think, that farm costs will be increasing if they have to get rid of things that work, the Ford F-150 pickup, a diesel tractor, being able to plow those type of fields. And you just don't have a green alternative. But that hasn't stopped politicians from trying to push it ahead and telling farmers, we know better about farming practices than you do.
Well, this was a great interview and a very interesting study. Thanks so much, Ray.
Thank y'all very much for having me back.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.